Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, or at least we're going to pretend it's Friday, October 12th, 2018. Got to do a pre-recorded show today. Big family event coming up. Never you mind what I'm up to. It's private. It's not a big deal. It's, it's actually a fun event. Anyway, point is, might as well, I guess, should I tell you what the event is? Is it okay? Is it a secret? Does anybody mind? Nobody's here. I'm the only one here in Kagro in the Morning World headquarters. My youngest son's bar mitzvah. Whee! It's going to be exciting today, tomorrow. He's a fountain pen, those of you who know the joke. And, so this means family is in, and errands need to be run, and arrangements need to be made. We're not making a huge deal of it, but it's a big deal in our family, and that means I gotta be off the air. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to go without fresh content, however, though it would have been a good idea, I must say, but there's too much that we need to catch up on. Yesterday, I hinted to you that we might get to Olivia Nuzzi's private Oval Office press conference with Donald Trump. I had heard it was nuts. I probably should have taken some time to make sure that it was nuts, but we'll roll the dice on this one. She usually comes up with good stuff. I thought we should share it before the weekend. Then perhaps on to some other stuff that has been waiting in the wings that I think we need to update our portfolios with. But let's start with this one. It's always promising and uplifting to be able to make fun of the president. Which to date you do not get murdered with a bone saw for in this country. I don't know how they murdered him, but they dismembered him with a bone saw over there in the Saudi Arabia place. Saudish Arabia, as we call it. Let's take a look at this, though, and try and put that one behind us for the moment. Just too horrific to contemplate. My private Oval Office press conference with Donald Trump, but also Mike Pence, John Kelly, and Mike Pompeo, because why would you leave the president alone to talk to a journalist? That's not wise. Begins this way. Around 12:20 p.m. on Tuesday, I was on my way out of the White House after a series of meetings in the West Wing. I was reporting on a question that has hung over this administration for months. How has Chief of Staff John Kelly managed to keep his job in spite of convincing and persistent rumors and reports that the president is unhappy with him and he is unhappy in his job? I stopped to talk to another reporter, and then I began to walk toward the North Gate. As I walked, I noticed I had a missed call, from a Washington number I didn't recognize. It was Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders. What could be more useless than that? She sounded very serious. She asked me if I had left yet. When I said no, she asked me to come back inside, and when she greeted me, she looked very serious. Not sure how she can do that, but okay. She implied she wanted me to go with her behind a door. This is scary in bone saw world. I didn't understand, maybe didn't quite hear her. Then she told me Trump wanted to speak to me. But I'm a little bit puzzled right off the bat. Like, why was that difficult to understand or secretive or anything? The president wants to talk with you. That's something that most reporters would like to hear, although I guess it is a little bit scary these days, but I don't know. It's weird that the president wants to talk to you. I don't know. She doesn't say she mumbled it. It's just, how could it be? I don't understand. Maybe I didn't quite hear her. I walked to the Oval Office. I guess that the president wanted to disabuse me of any notion that Kelly was about to be fired or had almost been fired many times before. I was right, but my imagination was too limited. What ensued amounted to a private press conference featuring a series of special guest stars from the highest echelon of the Trump administration to try to get me to change my mind. Interesting. I just heard that you were doing a story on this stuff, because he's got a huge vocabulary. The president said as he came into the Oval Office and sat down at the resolute desk. I sat in a chair across from him. Next to me were Sanders and Communications Director Bill Shine. General Kelly's doing a very good job, Trump told me. We have a very good relationship, another of his stock phrases. The White House is running very, very smoothly. We've had a big week We just got a Supreme Court justice on the bench. We have the USMCA, meaning the NAFTA replacement, and many other things. We had a great meeting with North Korea. It was a great meeting. I just wanted to say, as far as meetings go, it was great. That's what he says. We had a great meeting with North Korea. It was a great meeting. I know you just said that. The Secretary of State's coming just in 10 minutes, 2 weeks, whatever. He went on, but I want to tell you a couple of things. The chief is doing a very good job. I'm very happy with him. We have a good relationship, number one. Number two, I didn't offer anybody else the job. I didn't talk to anybody about the job. And I'm not looking. Now, look, with time, do people leave? As an example, Nikki Haley told me 6 months ago, even a year ago, but 6 months ago. What is it? She told me a year ago, 2 years, even 15 years ago, even 2 seconds ago. It doesn't matter. But time has no meaning. Time is a flat circle. Number two, I didn't offer anybody else a job. As an example, Nikki Haley told me 6 months ago, even a year ago, but no, actually not that, 6 months ago, that, she's been governor, she's done this, she's helped us with the campaign, a lot of good things. And you probably saw the conference. It was a very, very positive thing. We have a very positive story going on at the White House. We have a very positive story for the country. We're doing a great job. We have the greatest economy in the history of our country. We have among the greatest job numbers. Among many groups, we have the greatest job numbers. We have things going on that are phenomenal on trade. China wants to make a deal. I said, you're not ready yet, but they want to make a deal. And at some point, we might. Iran wants to make a deal. They all want to make a deal. We have great things going. We've got a very smooth running organization, even though it's never reported that way. So the real story is that. It's really the real story. He's so intelligent. It's fantastic. When you walk in here, you don't see the chaos. There's no chaos. The media likes to portray chaos. There's no chaos. I love chaos, but there is none, is what he's saying. It's amazing. I love chaos. I thrive on chaos. There's no chaos here, but I'm still thriving. What do you think? 6 months ago, even a year ago, but now 6 months, I would have said chaos. I love it. But now there's no chaos. There's no chaos. No chaos. You're the chaos, essentially. I'm leaving for Iowa in a little while. We're doing something that's going to be very exciting tonight in Iowa. A big, big announcement, actually. Doing 4 rallies this week. I think the rallies have, frankly, built up our poll numbers very greatly. Very bigly. What am I now in Rasmussen? 52? I don't know whether that's true. And by the way, what was the big thing in Iowa? Did anybody remember anything that would qualify as a big announcement from Iowa, or was that just another one? We're doing a big, big announcement. Major, major announcement. The announcement is the exits are clearly marked, and you can find restrooms fore and aft. I don't know what the big announcement was. I missed it. The question was directed at Sanders, the Rasmussen question, who confirmed the number. Note, the Rasmussen poll had Trump at 51%, not 52%, but there you go. It would have been 52 U.S. steel plants. The question, plus there's 10% they think of where people don't respond, unfortunately. I'm not sure this is nice or not nice, but when they don't respond, that means it's an automatic Trump vote. What? But it's 52, which it isn't. It's 51. Let me read that again. There's 10% they think where people don't respond, unfortunately. I'm not sure if this is nice or not nice, but when they don't respond, that means it's an automatic Trump vote. It means no such thing. He's a moron. Just, I don't know, in case you missed that or didn't understand that was the case. He's a moron. I got you. All right. And we're doing very well in the polls. You see what's happening with respect to the election. I mean, the midterms, even though I know historically the president, you don't tend to do so well in the midterms. But we have. This is a different presidency. And this is the greatest economy ever. So we'll have to test that. But even the polls are saying that we're going to have, we've really come a long way in the last 3 weeks. I think we're going to do well. And that's all I have to say. I just wanted to tell you that I'm very happy with General Kelly, and I get along very well with him. We have a very good relationship for the 15th time in this short conversation. And if we didn't, I wouldn't stand for it for a minute, and he wouldn't want it any other way. So it's just a different narrative than what you were saying. And with that, you're going to have to write what you have to write. But the truth is, we have a really smooth running White House, and nothing and nobody has done more in their first 2 years as president. We're not even up to the second year. This is extraordinary by most measures, but okay. The president craned his neck slightly upward in the direction of the door. "Could you give me the list, please?" he asked, raising his voice so a secretary could hear. "I've got to give you the list. Nobody has come close to doing what we've done in less than 2 years as president, whether it's regulations or tax cuts or so many other things. Things is a big word. The secretary walked into the room holding 2 sheets of computer paper. "Give that to Olivia," Trump said. "These are just some of the things that were done since taking office," he told me. The pages were stamped with 58 bullet points typed in large font. At the top, underlined, bold, and all caps, in the center of the backside. Okay, you remember the whole thing. All caps, it read, "Trump administration accomplishments." On the first page, the points related mostly to jobs numbers or executive orders or promises from the tax reform bill. On the second page, there were more puzzling accomplishments, like Republicans want strong borders. All caps when I forced that. Republicans want strong borders and no crime. Democrats want open borders, which equals massive crime. That's not an accomplishment. It's just something that he likes to say, which is also not true. So, Trump went on, it would be great to have an accurately written story. Because we do have, when you walk in here, I think you see, if you read something, it's totally different than the fact. Completely bonkers. Wow. I asked Trump to explain how the White House was different with Kelly as chief of staff. He's a 4-star Marine. He is a man who likes to see order and discipline, which I like. We came in, and it was more free-rolling. We did a lot. We did a lot during the entire period, but I think there is great order now. He claimed that this has never been a point of frustration, as has often been reported. No, I like it. I like order. I like it both ways. Uh-oh. Honestly, I've had it both ways. Uh-oh. I've had it both ways in my life and in my business. And sometimes freewheeling is a very good thing. You know, it's not a bad thing. We did a lot. If you look at the first 6 months, we did a lot. Like what? I asked. Well, he said, squinting his eyes in the direction of the papers I was holding, you could take a look at some of the things on the list. Some of that was done early. Look at the pipelines. That was done early. I got a lot of great job-producing events. A lot of regulation cutting. We did tremendous regulation cuts. That was all done pretty early. So what I'm saying, and this is not even updated, we have achieved a lot in the last month and a half, 2 months, since that's been done. But we've done a really great job. And so it's reported by those that want it to be accurately reported. And I think, at least, I should be able, because I know you're going to go in and you're going to write something, at least I should be able to tell you, out of respect, that the relationships are very good. And I think you could say, Sarah, that the relationships in the White House have been very good, especially over the last 6 months, 7 months. It's been very, very smooth. It's been very smooth running White House. Sanders agreed. Often, before an official departs his orbit, Trump publicly remarks that he's very fond of them. I began to ask Trump how he expected me to believe his relationship with Kelly was so good, given that fact when he cut in. Well, I made changes. For instance, Secretary of State. I put somebody in that I wanted. And it's really working out very well. He's done a fantastic job. Mike Pompeo. But that doesn't mean that we weren't doing a good job before, whether the relationships were good or not good. but I wanted to make a change, and I made a change. I completed asking the question about staffers who had been ousted in the past despite assurances from Trump that all was well. Like who? Trump asked. I offered Steve Bannon as an example. He asked if I'd seen Bannon on television lately, which I had. Well, I saw Steve Bannon. Haven't spoken to Steve Bannon in a year, but I saw Steve Bannon on television twice in the last month. And General, come here a moment. He still calls him General. Kelly had appeared in the room, a wary expression on his face, which resembles a cross between Wallace Shawn and Woody Harrelson. Okay. Kelly's military service began in 1970, and over the decades took him around the world. He'd served in Belgium, and he'd overseen U.S. and Iraqi forces in Iraq and operations across 32 countries in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. It seems silly to think that such a person would ever give a F, it's actually in there, about anything relating to matters of palace intrigue in this White House. Had he known we'd be discussing this? Had the president ordered him to be there? Was it all a coincidence? It is a small place, in fairness. Nobody tells you that before you visit. It's like it was built for elves. It's possible he had just been walking by. But if that was the case, the president's repeated comments about how serendipitous all of this was made it feel like a big production. This is Olivia. She's going to say very, very wonderful things about you. This is General Kelly, Trump said. Come on in, Mike. Closely behind Kelly was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who was scheduled for a 12:30 lunch with the president. It all revolves around meals for this guy. Olivia can write badly about you, Trump told him. The men laughed at the president's joke. Stay there for a second. I just wanted to see Olivia for 2 seconds, Trump said. Look who comes in. And we actually have lunch today, Trump said. Look who comes into my office. I'm so important. I know you're the president. I understand that. I mean, it's a mistake. It's a horrible mistake for the country. But you are. I expect that high-ranking officials are going to come around sniffing at you. Look who comes to see me. The Secretary of State. I'm so important. Sigh. I jokingly asked if I was invited to the lunch. Anytime you want, Trump said. Kelly, who was sitting down near me across from the president's desk, remarked, best French fries in the world. Trump didn't acknowledge him. Shut up, you're stupid. But Bannon, he said, picking up the conversation where we'd left off, if you'd seen Bannon on shows over the last month, he briefly went off the record. Okay, interesting. Fine. Look who you have here, he said. This is now picking up back on the record. He glanced toward the entryway again. Look who you have here. We had a meeting scheduled. Vice President Mike Pence walked into the room. Hey, this is Olivia. She's a disruptive writer, but that's okay, Trump told him. He laughed. This was beginning to feel ridiculous, like this was the reunion episode of a sitcom in which Bob Saget might come out next to an applause track. I explained to the president my point was not about Bannon specifically, but that generally he's made it difficult to believe what he says about whether or not he is going to keep a member of the staff around. Trump replied that he has good relationships, asking if I could name anyone who speaks bad about me on the record. People that are off the record, I think that doesn't even exist. I think writers make it up, he said. Generally. Not in all cases, but generally. Well, you've cited anonymous sources before, I said. Were they made up? He didn't respond. Instead, he said, I say this. We have a really great White House. We have a really successful White House. We have, I call it a well-oiled machine. It's ruled with tremendous people. What the fuck does that mean? It's ruled with tremendous people. And if you remember, you heard my story. When I got elected, I haven't been to Washington my whole life. Very rarely. Probably never slept over. He's on tape testifying on C-SPAN and before Congress. He probably didn't sleep over, but I haven't, like the way he starts, I haven't been to Washington my whole life, except for those times I testified before Congress. Well, I never slept over. It's a day ride. Well, all right. All of a sudden, I'm president of the United States. I didn't know a lot of people in Washington. Now I know everybody that I want to know, a lot of people, and I bring changes. And those changes have been great changes. One of them over there. He nodded in the direction of Pompeo, who was sitting behind me on the couch. I wanted to know if he was really happy here or if he misses New York. I love it. I think it's great. Do I like it? Do I like the work? I love it. I actually really love it. Do you know why I love it? Because you don't do it. That's why. One simple reason. Because nobody has accomplished as much in so short a period of time. Later, he would somewhat wistfully remark that he once lived near New York Magazine's former offices in Midtown Manhattan. Wow, that's super important. How are you measuring that exactly? I said. That is, that nobody has done more, nobody's accomplished more in such a short period of time. His eyes narrowed, which is hard to do. They're so puffy. Can you tell? See the list that's in your hand? But are you comparing it to a similar list from previous administrations? I asked. No, I'm saying in the first 2 years of a president, and we're not even at 2 years, nobody has come close to it. No one. Take a look. I mean, you take a look, and nobody has come close. So I heard you're going to do a nasty story. I laughed. Well, but it was, Trump said. And at least I should say, one of your things was that I offered Nick, that man right there, a job. I didn't. He just walked in. I turned around to see Nick Ayers, the vice president's chief of staff. I told her that. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Nick. I told her that, Ayers said. I don't even know what the hell's going on in this. One of the leads I was pursuing was a rumor that Trump had, at various times during Kelly's tenure, offered the chief of staff job to other people in the White House, including Ayers. I had put that specific question to several officials, citing a specific date and location for one of the meetings in which I understood the job had been discussed in late June, just before the publication of a Wall Street Journal story that named Ayers, along with the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney, as would-be Kelly replacements. And he would keep the other two jobs. Doesn't he already have two? He'd give him a third. Trump looked back at me. He has a good relationship with the general. I didn't offer Nick the job. I mean, I'm telling you in front. Now, you can write that I did. But now you have him, you have me, and I didn't offer him a job. And he didn't accept the job. And there was no offer. Oh, my God. I asked if he'd met with Ayers in the residence to have a conversation about the job. No. He's been in the residence, but the only time I can remember him being in the residence is with Mike. He's Mike's guy. And I would never offer him something without speaking to Mike. I don't do that. I don't take people from people. He paused for a beat. Even though I guess I can, he said, his tone even. Everyone laughed. I guess I didn't do it with an even tone. That's why it's not funny. There's no reason to do it, though. So your narrative is wrong. It's just amazing. We're all having lunch, and it's so great that you're all here. This was not set up, which of course means it was set up. I joked that it seemed very spontaneous. When he says, I didn't offer him a job, when he says I didn't, and when I didn't, it's just a false narrative. And I have a very good relationship with him. That's just a laugh line at this point. He glanced to my right where Kelly was sitting. And if I didn't, I'd have no problem. I'd say, John, time to go. But you know what? I'm very happy with him. He's happy with me. Have you ever had an argument in which you have, I began to say, Trump cut in. I argue with everyone, he said. The room erupted with laughter. Except Pompeo, Trump said, his face contorting in surprise. I don't think I've ever had an argument with Pompeo. Stand by, Pompeo said. Stand by. Stand by, Trump said. The day is young, Pence said. Sarah Huckabee Sanders cut in. Let's make this the last question. Has she asked the question yet? Oh, my God. Trump went on. I'm not sure I've ever had an argument with Mike. In this case, he meant the vice president. I asked Trump if he was worried as he looked forward about the midterms and about the Mueller investigation. Well, the Mueller investigation. If anything, it's showing that the Democrats colluded with Russia and others. The Democrats colluded with Russia. And it's showing there's no collusion from me. There never was. And yes, I'm very satisfied with the way that's going. It's a process. I'm very satisfied. I consider it to be an illegal investigation. It should never have been called. But is there anything there? Nothing. There's no collusion. There is no collusion. And by the way, I don't know if you heard, Richard Burr, North Carolina Senator Richard Burr, just came out. He said, no, we have found no collusion. He's a judge at the Senate committee. What? That's what he said. Note, Burr is chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, not a judge of any kind. And you know, Nunes and all of them, Congressman Nunes came out and said there's no collusion. So you have two committees that spent much more than a year on this, and they have found no collusion. Richard Burr just made the statement just very recently. He said, I found no collusion. You know why? Because there's no collusion. And they only interviewed like hundreds. I mean, the number of people is like incredible. The money that's been spent is incredible. They found no collusion. So as far as other things are concerned, I think we're doing just great. Yes, I'm concerned about the election. I'd rather win elections. I never lost an election in my life, okay? You know that, right? I've run one time. It was for the presidency. I actually had a senator come in and say, Mr. President, I've been a senator for 24 years. Sir, remember that's a tell. Sir, I think this is the way you should do it. I said, well, you know, I've just been a president for 2 years. It's the only time I ever ran for office. He said, that's one of the most amazing things that I've ever seen, and I've been doing this a long time. It's sort of interesting. It didn't happen, but I'm sure it's sort of interesting to him. Like his last three predecessors, Trump's presidency began with majorities in the House and Senate. If Republicans lose control of a chamber, not only will it be more difficult for the president to achieve his policy goals, but it will place impeachment on the table. During my reporting, the subject of whether Kelly was the right person to deal with the worst-case scenario came up often. I'd heard there was interest in having someone with more practical political experience and relationships on Capitol Hill in the job. It is amazing that the least political person in Washington, D.C. has the most political job in Washington, D.C. A former White House official told me. Kelly has the political instincts of my grandmother, which I assume are not good. Trump went on. But I've only run one election, and I've won. But we have an election coming up. I think we're going to do well. I think on the Senate side, we're looking very strong. In fact, we're getting numbers in that, Olivia, races that people said 6 months ago we wouldn't even challenge, we could win or do very well. You know, either way, we'll do very well. I won't name senators because I'm not looking to embarrass anybody or to have somebody say, oh, gee, you're wrong. But there are races for the Senate that really weren't going to be in play. I mean, one would be Heidi, meaning Heidi Heitkamp. I would say Heidi was not really in play, and now I just see that she's down. Supposedly 12 to 14, 10 to 14 points. I don't know. Maybe she'll do very well, but we'll see what happens. I think the Senate looks very good. In the House, I think it looks like we have a good chance of doing okay. I asked if he'd discussed among his staff what to do in the worst case scenario. No, I don't discuss it. If we don't do okay, I think we'll be in great shape. And if we do okay, I think we're going to do very well in the Senate. And I think we're going to do much. Here's the thing. I've given you, without the regulations and without the taxes, I've given you the greatest economy in the history of our country, or at minimum, close. 4.2%? Nobody thought that was even possible this early. You know, we're talking about early. Jobs numbers, production numbers, everything up. Confidence levels, everything. I think we're going to do very well in the elections. If we don't, we'll do very well. But we'll find a way to do very well. What? Nonsense. Okay. Sarah Huckabee Sanders cut in, but Trump said he had time for another question. Shut up. It's not the last question. We're going to do more. You're saying that the narratives about your White House and your staff are false. But why do, I began. Trump interrupted, asking me to speak louder. Have you been told that you speak very softly? He asked. You were saying that the narratives about your White House and your staff are incorrect. Why do they... Trump interrupted again, saying that was not true among everybody, just some people. He went on. I'll be honest. I think Fox has covered it very accurately. They say, we are producers. We produce like very few people anywhere produce. So others don't cover it as accurately. What? I'm lost. I asked why he believed non-Fox News narratives persisted. Why, for example, were there so many questions about his relationship with Kelly? Because you were going to write a bad story about the relationship. I have a good relationship. He looked over at Kelly. General, what do you think of the president? He asked. He's a great president, Kelly said. Do we disagree sometimes? We do. My job is to make sure that that man has all the information available from whatever source so that he makes the best decision. And then, when that decision is made, my job is to implement that decision. There is, to the best of my knowledge, no chaos in the building. We've gotten rid of a few bad actors, but everyone works very, very well together. The biggest surprise, when we bring new people in, like Bill Shine, it's like, I thought this place was going to be full of backstabbers and chaos. And Chief, people all like each other, to the best of my knowledge. A smile spread across the president's face. Cutting Kelly off, he said, Bill was actually a little disappointed. This prompted laughter around the room, but not from Kelly. He thought it would be a lot more exciting, Trump said. So that's why, Kelly said, with all due respect to you, people like you listen to people that I've had to let go. And they continue to report about chaos and this type of thing. The President of the United States is who I serve, right after the people of the United States and the Constitution. And right now, this president is well served, not just by me, but by an entire White House staff. With that, everyone rose, except for Pence, who was standing the whole time, hovering near my chair across from the president's desk. I respect you, Trump told me. I just wanted you to get the real picture. The timing was incredible. It was like we had a lunch plan, Pence said. Is that a correct statement? This was just like perfect timing, Trump said. There are nearly 1,000 results from the last 14 months for the paired terms John Kelly and fired in the news database. As soon as he entered the building, the guessing about his inevitable exit began. As did the leaks that his new colleagues, or the outsiders whose influence he thwarted, hoped they could push him out the door. But the longer he stayed, the more doubts emerged that had less to do with palace intrigue. Kelly's rules are suffocating the president. Kelly wants to send Jared and Ivanka home. And more with Kelly's actions. In February, members of the staff were disappointed with Kelly's handling of the scandal involving Rob Porter, the president's staff secretary who had been accused of abuse by his two ex-wives. Not only did he lie, he tried to get everybody else to lie, a former White House official told me. People had deferred to him because he was a 4-star Marine general, served his country, Gold Star father. All of these things made you think, what a patriotic, upstanding American serving his country. I viewed him as this giant 4-star general, everything that goes along with that. He's very petty. He's a small man. How interesting. There's always chatter about who could replace Kelly. This had been unchanged by the White House's decision to claim that Trump has asked him to remain on the job through 2020. Trying to predict the outcome is a fool's errand. Trump's decision-making style is such that up until the moment something begins happening, you can trust that it won't happen. Or you can't trust that I got it backwards. But I think I have it right, but what it actually is you can't trust that it will happen. Dumb luck was the phrase one administration official used to explain Kelly's endurance. The president can only focus his anger or frustrations for so long before he moves on to the next thing. Meaning if someone is plotting to get rid of Kelly, convincing the president to concentrate on the idea that he's a problem matters more than whether or not he actually is a problem. This is where Kelly is helped by the fact that his enemies are even more inept than they believe he is. When the president says, "I need you to leave," Kelly just ignores him. The administration official said, that according to this administration official, I suppose, "I think the president just doesn't know who to call to fire him. Normally, if the president wants somebody fired, he would call Kelly to do it, but there's nobody to call." As I turned to follow Sanders and Schein out of the room, someone said, "Hey, Olivia." I turned toward the room again to see Kelly and Ayers entwined, their arms stretched around each other and their faces pressed close together. They smiled theatrically. "This is my friend," Kelly said. "Yes, and he's mine," Ayers said, "and I told her that. She knows that." And that is the end of this very, very weird article. And I guess it means that John Kelly's going to be fired. Because Trump said he wasn't going to fire him. That's the reason. All right, so it is Friday, and Friday is often a time that we set aside for catching up on long stories about other countries. I don't know, that's about as general a category as I could come up with. Occasionally we use Fridays to catch up on things that are going on in China, occasionally and things that are going on in the Middle East, specifically Saudi Arabia, and there's plenty to catch up on, of course, with Saudi Arabia as their timeline gets darker and darker. But I actually wanted to get to something on China today, something I've been holding for a little while, just a couple days, maybe a week or so. The October 4th Bloomberg Business Week story. Maybe some of you have already read it or paid some attention to it. The Big Hack. This touches on something that we've hit on the show a number of times, just in general, and one that I think poses a pretty significant problem for national security, especially in light of, the dotard's on-again, off-again love affair with the Chinese president and their technology sector, ZTE in particular. The Big Hack, how China used a tiny chip to infiltrate U.S. companies. This is a huge nightmare and something we've thought about in the abstract, not as in the context of an attack or an ongoing program by the Chinese government, although that possibility has come up in the past, but just the idea of how much of our security can be compromised in ways we didn't anticipate, or we only anticipated in science fiction prior to what's going on now. The subheader here, the attack by Chinese spies reached almost 30 U.S. companies, including Amazon and Apple, by compromising America's technology supply chain, according to extensive interviews with government and corporate sources. Let's take a look. Jordan Robertson and Michael Riley are the writers on this piece. Again, Bloomberg Business Week, October 4th. In 2015, Amazon.com, Incorporated, as they like to refer to it because it's Business Week, it's just Amazon to the rest of us, Amazon.com, Incorporated, began quietly evaluating a startup called Elemental Technologies, a potential acquisition to help with a major expansion of its streaming video service known today as Amazon Prime Video. Based in Portland, Oregon, Elemental made software for compressing massive video files and formatting them for different devices. Its technology had helped stream the Olympic Games online, communicate with the International Space Station, and funnel drone footage to the Central Intelligence Agency. Elemental's national security contracts weren't the main reason for the proposed acquisition, but they fit nicely with Amazon's government business, such as the highly secure cloud that Amazon Web Services, or AWS, was building for the CIA. Yikes. I didn't even know about that one, I don't think. Anyway, to help with due diligence, AWS, which was overseeing the prospective acquisition, hired a third-party company to scrutinize Elemental's security, according to one person familiar with the process. The first pass uncovered troubling issues, prompting AWS to take a closer look at Elemental's main product, the expensive servers that customers installed in their networks to handle the video compression. These servers were assembled for Elemental by Supermicro Incorporated, a San Jose-based company commonly known as Supermicro, that's also one of the world's biggest suppliers of server motherboards, the fiberglass-mounted clusters of chips and capacitors that act as the neurons of data centers large and small. In late spring of 2015, Elemental's staff boxed up several servers and sent them to Ontario, Canada, for the third-party security company to test, the person says. Nested on the server's motherboards, the testers found a tiny microchip, not much bigger than a grain of rice, that wasn't part of the board's original design. Amazon reported the discovery to U.S. authorities, sending a shudder through the intelligence community. Elemental's servers could be found in Department of Defense data centers, the CIA's drone operations, and the onboard networks of Navy warships. And Elemental was just one of hundreds of Supermicro customers. During the ensuing top-secret probe, which remains open more than 3 years later, investigators determined that the chips allowed the attackers to create a stealth doorway into any network that included the altered machines. Multiple people familiar with the matter say investigators found that the chips had been inserted at factories run by manufacturing subcontractors in China. Yeah, it's pretty much the nightmare scenario. This attack was something graver than the software-based incidents the world has grown accustomed to seeing. Hardware hacks are more difficult to pull off and potentially more devastating, promising the kind of long-term stealth access that spy agencies are willing to invest millions of dollars and many years to get. There are two ways for spies to alter the guts of computer equipment. One, known as interdiction, consists of manipulating devices as they're in transit from the manufacturer to the customer. This approach is favored by U.S. spy agencies, according to documents leaked by former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden. The other method involves seeding changes from the very beginning. One country, in particular, has an advantage executing this kind of attack: China, which by some estimates makes 75% of the world's mobile phones and 90% of its PCs. Still, to actually accomplish a seeding attack would mean developing a deep understanding of a product's design, manipulating components at the factory, and ensuring that the doctored devices made it through the global logistics chain to the desired location. A feat akin to throwing a stick in the Yangtze River upstream from Shanghai and ensuring that it washes ashore in Seattle. Having a well-done nation-state level hardware implant or implant surface would be like witnessing a unicorn jumping over a rainbow, says Joe Grand, a hardware hacker and the founder of Grand Idea Studio, Incorporated. Hardware is just so far off the radar, it's almost treated like black magic. But that's just what U.S. investigators found. The chips had been inserted during the manufacturing process, two officials say, by operatives from a unit of the People's Liberation Army. In Supermicro, China's spies appear to have found a perfect conduit for what U.S. officials now describe as the most significant supply chain attack known to have been carried out against American companies. Think about it for just a second. What a tremendous advantage a totalitarian dictatorship has in making these things happen, or someplace where there's that kind of government control. It's a difficult thing to disguise government spies stepping into an American manufacturing concern and implanting chips either with or without the manufacturing company's knowledge. But of course, in China, you can simply mandate these things. There are going to be People's Liberation Army liaison officers in your factory because that's what we say. And we may or may not tell you why they're going to be there, but they're going to be there, and you have nothing to say about it. And that puts them at a distinct advantage in this sort of supply chain attack, doesn't it? One official says investigators found that it eventually affected almost 30 companies, including a major bank, government contractors, than the world's most valuable company, Apple Incorporated. Apple was an important Supermicro customer and had planned to order more than 30,000 of its servers in 2 years for a new global network of data centers. 3 senior insiders at Apple say that in the summer of 2015, it too found malicious chips on Supermicro motherboards. Apple severed ties with Supermicro the following year for what it describes as unrelated reasons. In emailed statements, Amazon, which announced its acquisition of Elemental in September of 2015, Apple and Supermicro disputed summaries of Bloomberg Businessweek's reporting. It's untrue that AWS knew about a supply chain compromise, an issue with malicious chips or hardware modifications when acquiring Elemental, Amazon wrote. I don't know if that's really actually the better position to take, but okay. On this we can be very clear. They continued, Apple has never found malicious chips, hardware manipulations, or vulnerabilities purposely planted in any server. Apple wrote, we remain unaware of any such investigation, wrote a spokesman for Supermicro, Perry Hayes. The Chinese government didn't directly address questions about manipulation of Supermicro servers, issuing a statement that read in part, supply chain safety in cyberspace is an issue of common concern, and China is also a victim. The FBI and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, representing the CIA and NSA, declined to comment. The company's denials are countered by 6 current and former senior national security officials who, in conversations that began during the Obama administration and continued under the Trump administration, detailed the discovery of the chips and the government's investigation. One of those officials and 2 people inside AWS provided extensive information on how the attack played out at Elemental and Amazon. The official and one of the insiders also described Amazon's cooperation with the government investigation. In addition to the 3 Apple insiders, 4 of the 6 U.S. officials confirmed that Apple was a victim. In all, 17 people confirmed the manipulation of Supermicro's hardware and other elements of the attack. The sources were granted anonymity because of the sensitive and in some cases classified nature of the information. One government official says China's goal was long-term access to high-value corporate secrets and sensitive government networks. No consumer data is known to have been stolen. The ramifications of the attack continue to play out. The Trump administration has made computer and networking hardware, including motherboards, a focus of its latest round of trade sanctions against China, and White House officials have made it clear they think companies will begin shifting their supply chains to other countries as a result. That is one of the big dangers of a play like this. Such a shift might assuage officials who have been warning for years about the security of the supply chain, even though they've never disclosed a major reason for their concerns. Now, how the hack worked, according to U.S. officials, there's a little graphic here. And in case you are missing any of the moving parts or the steps in all of this, it goes something like this. I'll just sort of read my way through this little embedded chart here. First, a Chinese military unit designed and manufactured microchips as small as a sharpened pencil tip. And to helpfully illustrate that, they show a enlarged picture of a sharpened pencil tip and then a little chip that is about that size. I don't know that was absolutely necessary, but they needed some graphic elements for this thing. I know what a pencil looks like and how big the tip is. And of course, this picture doesn't show me how big the tip is. It shows me a not to scale pencil tip so that I can see the chip. But whatever. I don't know. The editors thought this was a great idea. Anyway, so Chinese military unit designs and manufactures this tiny, tiny little chip. Some of the chips were built to look like signal conditioning couplers. Some of you may actually know what those are. And they incorporated memory, networking capability, and sufficient processing power for an attack. Step 2, obviously, the microchips are inserted at Chinese factories that supplied Supermicro, one of the world's biggest sellers of server motherboards. And of course, you look at a server motherboard and it's full of this crap, and a little tiny extra chip in there is going to be extraordinarily hard to detect for someone who doesn't know what they're looking for. That's why you get one of these third-party expert companies, I guess. Step 3, the compromised motherboards were built into servers assembled by Supermicro. Step 4, the sabotaged servers made their way inside data centers operated by dozens of companies. Then 5, when a server was installed and switched on, the microchip altered the operating system's core so it could accept modifications. The chip could also contact computers controlled by the attackers in search of further instructions and code. That's effing dangerous. So there it is. Now, continuing with the story, back in 2006, 3 engineers in Oregon had a clever idea. Demand for mobile video was about to explode, and they predicted that broadcasters would be desperate to transform programs designed to fit TV screens into the various formats needed for viewing on smartphones, laptops, and other devices. To meet the anticipated demand, the engineers started Elemental Technologies, assembling what one former advisor to the company calls a genius team to write code that would adapt the super-fast graphics chips being produced for high-end video gaming machines. The resulting software dramatically reduced the time it took to process large video files. Elemental then loaded the software onto custom-built servers, emblazoned with its leprechaun green logos. I guess this was was the inspiration for Pied Piper in Silicon Valley? Maybe. Elemental servers sold for as much as $100,000 each, at profit margins as high as 70%, according to a former advisor to the company. 2 of Elemental's biggest early clients were the Mormon Church, which uses the technology to beam sermons to congregations around the world. Okay. And the adult film industry, which did not. That's a good line. I like the minimalism there, guys. Elemental also started working with American spy agencies. What a mix, huh? In 2009, the company announced a development partnership with In-Q-Tel Incorporated, the CIA's investment arm. A deal that paved the way for Elemental servers to be used in national security missions across the U.S. government. It's a dirty business, I guess, but I guess about the only way that the United States, in keeping with its capitalist system, could compete with the Chinese in this particular sector of technology, right? They want these things developed. The Chinese can just sort of mandate them developed and spend national funds on them. We have to have the CIA have an investment arm and encourage the development of these products in the private sector. Well, okay, that puts us one step behind, but it's an interesting adaptation. So where were we? In 2009, the company announced a development partnership with In-Q-Tel in a deal that paved the way for Elemental servers to be used in national security missions across the U.S. government. Public documents, including the company's own promotional materials, show that the servers have been used inside Department of Defense data centers to process drone and surveillance camera footage, on Navy warships to transmit feeds of airborne missions, and inside government buildings to enable secure video conferencing. NASA, both houses of Congress, and the Department of Homeland Security have also been customers. This portfolio made Elemental a target for foreign adversaries. Supermicro had been an obvious choice to build Elemental servers. Headquartered north of San Jose's airport, up a smoggy stretch of Interstate 880, the company was founded by Charles Liang, a Taiwanese engineer who attended graduate school in Texas and then moved west to start Supermicro with his wife in 1993. Silicon Valley was then embracing outsourcing, forging a pathway from Taiwanese and later Chinese factories to American consumers, and Liang added a comforting advantage. Supermicro's motherboards would be engineered mostly in San Jose, close to the company's biggest clients, even if the products were manufactured overseas. Today, Supermicro sells more server motherboards than almost anyone else. It also dominates the $1 billion market for boards used in special purpose computers, from MRI machines to weapons systems. Its motherboards can be found in made-to-order server setups at banks, hedge funds, cloud computing providers, and web hosting services, among other places. Supermicro has assembly facilities in California, the Netherlands, and Taiwan, but its motherboards, its core product, are nearly all manufactured by contractors in China, because it's cheap. Right? Why is it cheap? Because the manufacturer is, of course, subsidized by, well, one, the fact of low wages in China, and that itself maintained as an active program under the Chinese government. And who cares if they're profitable if they're handing out little motherboards filled with spy chips on them? The return on investment is more than worth it. The company's pitch to customers hinges on unmatched customization made possible by hundreds of full-time engineers and a catalog encompassing more than 600 designs. The majority of its workforce in San Jose is Taiwanese or Chinese, and Mandarin is the preferred language, with Hanzi filling the whiteboards, according to 6 former employees. Chinese pastries are delivered every week. How nice. And many routine calls are done twice, once for English-only workers and again in Mandarin. The latter are more productive, according to people who've been on both. These overseas ties, especially the widespread use of Mandarin, would have made it easier for China to gain an understanding of Supermicro's operations and potentially to infiltrate the company. Whatever happened to, you're in America, speak English? I guess that only works for low-income, low-wage workers who happen to be speaking Spanish. But, hey, maybe we can turn the bigots on these guys, too. I don't know if that's a good idea. Not a good idea to loose bigots on anybody. A U.S. official says the government's probe is still examining whether spies were planted inside Supermicro or other American companies to aid the attack, or whether the spies were just listening on the other end of those chips. Well, I guess that's a possibility, too. With more than 900 customers in 100 countries by 2015, Supermicro offered inroads to a bountiful collection of sensitive targets. Think of Supermicro as the Microsoft of the hardware world, says a former U.S. intelligence official who's studied Supermicro and its business model. Attacking Supermicro motherboards is like attacking Windows. It's like attacking the whole world. Well before evidence of the attack surfaced inside the networks of U.S. companies, American intelligence sources were reporting that China's spies had plans to introduce malicious microchips into the supply chain. The sources weren't specific, according to a person familiar with the information they provided, and millions of motherboards are shipped to the U.S. annually. But in the first half of 2014, a different person briefed on high-level discussions says intelligence officials went to the White House with something more concrete. China's military was preparing to insert the chips into Supermicro motherboards bound for U.S. companies. So we knew. The specificity of the information was remarkable, but so were the challenges it posed. Issuing a broad warning to Supermicro's customers could have crippled the company, a major American hardware maker, and it wasn't clear from the intelligence whom the operation was targeting or what its ultimate aims were. Plus, without confirmation that anyone had been attacked, the FBI was limited in how it could respond. The White House requested periodic updates as information came in. The person familiar with the discussions says Apple made its discovery of suspicious chips inside Supermicro servers around May 2015 after detecting odd networking activity and firmware problems, according to a person familiar with the timeline. 2 of the senior Apple insiders say the company reported the incident to the FBI but kept details about what it had detected tightly held, even internally. Government investigators were still chasing clues on their own when Amazon made its discovery and gave them access to the sabotaged hardware, according to one U.S. official. This created an invaluable opportunity for intelligence agencies and the FBI, by then running a full investigation led by its cyber and counterintelligence teams, to see what the chips looked like and how they worked. The chips on Elemental servers were designed to be as inconspicuous as possible, according to one person who saw a detailed report prepared for Amazon by its third-party security contractor, as well as a second person who saw digital photos and X-ray images of the chips incorporated into a later report prepared by Amazon's security team. Gray or off-white in color, they looked more like signal conditioning couplers, another common motherboard component, than microchips, and so they were unlikely to be detectable without specialized equipment. Depending on the board model, the chips varied slightly in size, suggesting that the attackers had supplied different factories with different batches. Officials familiar with the investigation say the primary role of implants such as these is to open doors that other attackers can go through. Hardware attacks are about access, as one former senior official puts it. In simplified terms, the implants on Supermicro hardware manipulated the core operating instructions to tell the server what to do as data move across a motherboard. Two people familiar with the chip's operations say. This happened at a crucial moment, as small bits of the operating system were being stored in the board's temporary memory en route to the server's central processor, the CPU. The implant was placed on the board in a way that allowed it to effectively edit this information queue, injecting its own code or altering the order of the instructions the CPU was meant to follow. Deviously small changes could create disastrous effects. Since the implants were small, the amount of code they contained was small as well, but they were capable of doing two very important things: telling the device to communicate with one of several anonymous computers elsewhere on the internet that were loaded with more complex code, and preparing the device's operating system to accept this new code. The illicit chips could do all this because they were connected to the baseboard management controller, a kind of super chip that administrators use to remotely log in to problematic servers, giving them access to the most sensitive code even on machines that have crashed or are turned off. This system could let the attackers alter how the device functioned, line by line, however they wanted, leaving no one the wiser. To understand the power that would give them, take this hypothetical example. Somewhere in the Linux operating system, which runs in many servers, is code that authorizes a user by verifying a typed password against a stored encrypted one. An implanted chip can alter part of that code so the server won't check for a password. And presto, a secure machine is open to any and all users. You think it's asking for a password, it just really isn't. Interesting. A chip can also steal encryption keys for secure communications, block security updates that would neutralize the attack, and open up new pathways to the internet. Should some anomaly be noticed, it would likely be cast as an unexplained oddity. The hardware opens whatever door it wants, says Joe Fitzpatrick, founder of Hardware Security Resources, LLC, a company that trains cybersecurity professionals in hardware hacking techniques. By the way, I don't know whether they contemplate this in this article at any point, but I'm sure by now most of you have thought, that's how, if I were an evil person, I would build one of those electronic voting machines. I mean, everybody has always sort of fantasized that there were somehow undetectable ways in and out that left no traces that you could use to manipulate the vote count and not leave any evidence behind. And I guess this would be one of those ways if you got into those machines. U.S. officials, to continue with the story, had caught China experimenting with hardware tampering before, but they had never seen anything of this scale and ambition. The security of the global technology supply chain had been compromised, even if consumers and most companies didn't know it yet. What remained for investigators to learn was how the attackers had so thoroughly infiltrated Supermicro's production process and how many doors they'd opened into American targets. It seems to me we've just had it explained to us how the attackers so thoroughly infiltrated Supermicro's production process. The Chinese government said, these things are going into motherboards, period, the end. And Sun Micro didn't know about it and built their machines around those motherboards. Unlike software-based hacks, hardware manipulation creates a real-world trail. Components leave a wake of shipping manifests and invoices. Boards have serial numbers that trace to specific factories. To track the corrupted chips to their source, U.S. intelligence agencies began following Supermicro's serpentine supply chain in reverse, a person briefed on evidence gathered during the probe says. As recently as 2016, according to DigiTimes, a news site specializing in supply chain research, Supermicro had 3 primary manufacturers constructing its motherboards, 2 headquartered in Taiwan and 1 in Shanghai. When such suppliers are choked with big orders, they sometimes parcel out work to subcontractors. In order to get further down the trail, U.S. spy agencies drew on the prodigious tools at their disposal. They sifted through communications intercepts, tapped informants in Taiwan and China, even tracked key individuals through their phones, according to the person briefed on evidence gathered during the probe. Probably shouldn't have let that one out. Eventually, that person says, if it's true, they traced the malicious chips to 4 subcontracting factories that had been building Supermicro motherboards for at least 2 years. As the agents monitored interactions among Chinese officials, motherboard manufacturers, and middlemen, they glimpsed how the seeding process worked. Hooray, now we can find out. In some cases, plant managers were approached by people who claimed to represent Supermicro or who held positions suggesting a connection to the government. The middlemen would request changes to the motherboard's original designs, initially offering bribes in conjunction with their unusual requests. If that didn't work, they threatened factory managers with inspections that could shut down their plants. There's where the government's leverage comes in. Once arrangements were in place, the middlemen would organize delivery of the chips to the factories. The investigators concluded that this intricate scheme was the work of a People's Liberation Army unit specializing in hardware attacks, according to 2 people briefed on its activities. The existence of this group has never been revealed before, but one official says, "We've been tracking these guys for longer than we'd like to admit." The unit is believed to focus on high-priority targets, including advanced commercial technology and the computers of rival militaries. In past attacks, it targeted the designs for high-performance computer chips and computing systems of large U.S. Internet providers. Provided details of Business Week's reporting, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs sent a statement that said, "China is a resolute defender of cybersecurity." The ministry added that in 2011, China proposed international guarantees on hardware security along with other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a regional security body. The statement concluded, "We hope parties make less gratuitous accusations and suspicions, but conduct more constructive talk and collaboration so that we can work together in building a peaceful, safe, open, cooperative, and orderly cyberspace." The Supermicro attack was on another order entirely from earlier episodes attributed to the PLA. It threatened to have reached a dizzying array of end users, with some vital ones in the mix. Apple, for its part, had used Supermicro hardware in its data centers sporadically for years, but the relationship intensified after 2013 when Apple acquired a startup called Topsy Labs, which created super-fast technology for indexing and searching vast troves of Internet content. By 2014, the startup was put to work building small data centers in or near major global cities. This project, known internally as Leadbelly, was designed to make the search function for Apple's voice assistant, Siri, faster, according to the 3 senior Apple insiders. Documents seen by Business Week show that in 2014, Apple planned to order more than 6,000 Supermicro servers for installation in 17 locations, including Amsterdam, Chicago, Hong Kong, Los Angeles, New York, San Jose, Singapore, and Tokyo, plus 4,000 servers for its existing North Carolina and Oregon data centers. Those orders were supposed to double to 20,000 by 2015. Leadbelly made Apple an important Supermicro customer at the exact time the PLA was found to be manipulating the vendor's hardware. Project delays and early performance problems meant that around 7,000 Supermicro servers were humming in Apple's network by the time the company's security team found the added chips. Because Apple didn't, according to a U.S. official, provide government investigators with access to its facilities or the tampered hardware, the extent of the attack remained outside their view. Oh, look, here's another embedded illustration of just how small the chips are, with a gigantic penny, or what looks to be a gigantic penny in the photo here. It's many times larger than a regular penny, but tiny little chip here compared to the enormous penny. In other words, it's a very, 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 very small chip. Has everyone grasped that now? Good. American investigators eventually figured out who else had been hit. Since the implanted chips were designed to ping anonymous computers on the internet for further instructions, operatives could hack those computers to identify others who'd been affected. Although the investigators couldn't be sure they'd found every victim, a person familiar with the U.S. probe says they ultimately concluded that the number was almost 30 companies. That left the question of whom to notify and how. U.S. officials had been warning for years that hardware made by two Chinese telecommunications giants, Huawei, who knows how you even say it, Huawei. Do you have anything from them? Huawei Corp. And ZTE Corporation. By golly, if it isn't ZTE, was subject to Chinese government manipulation. Both Huawei and ZTE, Huawei, I think we're even close on that. Both of them have said no such tampering has occurred. But a similar public alert regarding a U.S. company was out of the question. Instead, U.S. officials reached out to a small number of important Supermicro customers. One executive of a large web hosting company said the message he took away from the exchange was clear: Supermicro's hardware couldn't be trusted. That's been the nudge to everyone. Get that crap out, the person says. Amazon, for its part, began acquisition talks with an Elemental competitor, but according to one person familiar with Amazon's deliberations, it reversed course in the summer of 2015 after learning that Elemental's board was nearing a deal with another buyer. Amazon announced its acquisition of Elemental in September of 2015 in a transaction whose value one person familiar with the deal places at $350 million. Multiple sources say that Amazon intended to move Elemental's software to AWS's cloud, whose chips, motherboards, and servers are typically designed in-house and built by factories that Amazon contracts from directly. No word on whether they're in China, though. A notable exception was AWS's data centers inside China, which were filled with Supermicro-built servers, according to two people with knowledge of AWS's operations there. Mindful of the Elemental findings, Amazon's security team conducted its own investigation into AWS's Beijing facilities and found altered motherboards there as well, including more sophisticated designs than they'd previously encountered. In one case, the malicious chips were thin enough that they'd been embedded between the layers of fiberglass onto which the other components were attached. Wow. According to one person who saw pictures of the chips. That generation of chips was smaller than a sharpened pencil tip. Darn it, our whole pencil tip thing is now invalid. This person says, Amazon denies that AWS knew of servers found in China containing malicious chips. Why? China has long been known to monitor banks, manufacturers, and ordinary citizens on its own soil, and the main customers of AWS's China cloud were domestic companies or foreign entities with operations there. Still, the fact that the country appeared to be conducting those operations inside Amazon's cloud presented the company with a Gordian knot. Its security team determined that it would be difficult to quietly remove the equipment, and that even if they could devise a way, doing so would alert the attackers that the chips had been found, according to a person familiar with the company's probe. Instead, the team developed a method of monitoring the chips. In the ensuing months, they detected brief check-in communications between the attackers and the sabotaged servers, but didn't see any attempts to remove data. That likely meant either that the attackers were saving the chips for a later operation, or that they'd infiltrated other parts of the network before the monitoring began. Neither possibility was reassuring. When, in 2016, the Chinese government was about to pass a new cybersecurity law, seen by many outside the country as a pretext to give authorities wider access to sensitive data, Amazon decided to act. The person familiar with the company's probe says, in August, it transferred operational control of its Beijing data center to its local partner, Beijing Sinet, S-I-N-N-E-T, a move the company said was needed to comply with the incoming law. The following November, Amazon sold the entire infrastructure to Beijing Sinet for about $300 million, the person familiar with Amazon's probe casts the sale as a choice to hack off the diseased limb. As for Apple, one of the three senior insiders says that in the summer of 2015, a few weeks after it identified the malicious chips, the company started removing all Supermicro servers from its data centers, a process Apple referred to internally as going to zero. Every Supermicro server, all 7,000 or so, was replaced in a matter of weeks, the senior insider says. Apple denies that any servers were removed. Still puzzled by that. In 2016, Apple informed Supermicro that it was severing their relationship entirely, a decision a spokesman for Apple ascribed in response to Businessweek's questions to an unrelated and relatively minor security incident. That August, Supermicro's CEO, Liang, revealed that the company had lost two major customers. Although he didn't name them, one was later identified in news reports as Apple. He blamed competition, but his explanation was vague. When customers asked for lower price, our people did not respond quickly enough, he said on a conference call with analysts. Hayes, the Supermicro spokesman, said the company has never been notified of the existence of malicious chips on its motherboards by either customers or U.S. law enforcement. Concurrent with the illicit chips discovery in 2015 and the unfolding investigation, Supermicro has been plagued by an accounting problem, which the company characterizes as an issue related to the timing of certain revenue recognition. After missing two deadlines to file quarterly and annual reports required by regulators, Supermicro was delisted from the NASDAQ on August 23rd of this year. It marked an extraordinary stumble for a company whose annual revenue had risen sharply in the previous 4 years, from a reported $1.5 billion in 2014 to a projected $3.2 billion this year. One Friday in late September of 2015, President Barack Obama and Chinese President Xi Jinping appeared together at the White House for an hour-long press conference headlined by a landmark deal on cybersecurity. After months of negotiations, the U.S. had extracted from China a grand promise. It would no longer support the theft by hackers of U.S. intellectual property to benefit Chinese companies. Left out of those pronouncements, according to a person familiar with discussions among senior officials across the U.S. government, was the White House's deep concern that China was willing to offer this concession because it was already developing far more advanced and surreptitious forms of hacking founded on its near monopoly of the technology supply chain. In the weeks after the agreement was announced, the U.S. government quietly raised the alarm with several dozen tech executives and investors at a small invite-only meeting in McLean, Virginia, organized by the Pentagon. According to someone who was present, Defense Department officials briefed the technologists on a recent attack and asked them to think about creating commercial products that could detect hardware implants. Attendees weren't told the name of the hardware maker involved, but it was clear to at least some in the room that it was Supermicro, the person says. The problem under discussion wasn't just technological. It spoke to decisions made decades ago to send advanced production work to Southeast Asia. In the intervening years, low-cost Chinese manufacturing had come to underpin the business models of many of America's largest technology companies. Early on, Apple, for instance, made many of its sophisticated electronics domestically. Then, in 1992, it closed a state-of-the-art plant for motherboard and computer assembly in Fremont, California, and sent much of that work overseas. Over the decades, the security of the supply chain became an article of faith, despite repeated warnings by Western officials. A belief formed that China was unlikely to jeopardize its position as workshop to the world by letting its spies meddle in its factories. That left the decision about where to build commercial systems resting largely on where capacity was greatest and cheapest. You end up with a classic Satan's bargain, one former U.S. official says. By the way, Satan's bargain is otherwise known in most cases as relative advantage and is a key tenet underlying American-style economics. I mean, now that's Satan's bargain to allow the cheapest manufacturer to gain that advantage, and you just buy from the cheapest supplier. I mean, that's a basic tenet of everything we do. Oh boy. Satan seems to be everywhere in this system. All right, so there we have it. You end up with the classic Satan's bargain, said one former U.S. official. You can have less supply than you want and guarantee it's secure, or you can have the supply you need, but there will be a risk. Every organization has accepted the second proposition. In the 3 years since the briefing in McLean, no commercially viable way to detect attacks like the one on Supermicro's motherboards has emerged, or has looked likely to emerge. Few companies have the resources of Apple and Amazon, and it took some luck even for them to spot the problem. This stuff is at the cutting edge of the cutting edge, and there is no easy technological solution. One of the people present in McLean says, you have to invest in things that the world wants. You cannot invest in things that the world is not ready to accept yet. And that brings us to the end of this piece. Very interesting. There are a number of different directions we may go based on this. Let's run back to Pocket and see what follows this up best. Well, let's supplement that story with one from NPR that ran around the same time a couple days later, and in fact makes mention of the previous article. China makes a big play in Silicon Valley. Jackie Northam, the reporter on this piece. A year ago, it begins, Chinese President Xi Jinping stood before the 19th Communist Party Congress and laid out his ambitious plan for China to become a world leader by 2025 in advanced technologies such as robotics, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. He was seen as a direct challenge to U.S. leadership in advanced technology. James Lewis, a specialist in China and technology at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, says China recognizes that technological superiority helps give the United States an edge in national security and wants in on it. The Chinese figured out that technology is the key to wealth and power, and the sources of technology is still the West for China, says Lewis. The question is, how do they get their hands on that Western technology? The Chinese government has been forming global partnerships with Western think tanks, recruiting key talent at networking events sponsored by the Chinese government, and working with U.S. universities, says Michael Brown, managing director of the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Unit in Mountain View, California. The unit was set up in 2015 to help the U.S. military capitalize on emerging commercial technologies. I'd say they're very systematic, very long-term in their approach, and very well-funded, Brown says. And he notes there is serious concern in Washington that China could acquire too much sensitive U.S. technology and transfer it back home. They don't play by the same rules that we do. So cyber theft is on the table, industrial espionage is on the table, Brown says. And of course, we've seen just how they might conduct that espionage in the previous article. Just this past week, that gets the mention next, that same article. Bloomberg Businessweek magazine reported that the United States was investigating whether China had infiltrated the Pentagon and major companies such as Apple and Amazon by building spy chips into server motherboards. The motherboards were manufactured in China. The companies deny the allegations. Chinese companies also troll bankruptcy courts looking for failing U.S. firms and target small enterprises making valuable technology such as semiconductors. Chinese companies are also pumping millions of dollars and other resources into tech firms in Europe and the U.S. as a way to capture innovation and know-how. That's illustrated in Sunnyvale, the heart of Silicon Valley, where U.S. tech giants including Microsoft, LinkedIn, and Yahoo have a presence. Does LinkedIn really count as a tech giant? Right next to a Google complex is a building housing the offices of Baidu, China's largest internet provider and Google's rival. Baidu opened its innovation center, called the Institute of Deep Learning, 4 years ago, with a focus on a self-driving vehicle called Apollo. Other Chinese tech powerhouses, Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei, remember them, who I couldn't pronounce last time, also have Silicon Valley research and development centers. Instead of buying an existing U.S. business, these Chinese tech giants come to the U.S. and build new companies from the ground up in what's known as greenfield investments. Lewis says these Chinese tech companies hire away a lot of U.S. employees who might otherwise work for American businesses. People change jobs frequently in the tech industry, and Chinese businesses say, I'll pay you a little bit more than the market rate. You'll get a lot of talent, he says. This is a way to acquire know-how. Chinese venture capital has helped fuel a surge of minority investments in U.S. tech startups over the past few years. These startups could be working on breakthrough technology. Adam Lysenko, a senior analyst at Rhodium Group, an economic research firm, says American entities represent the largest venture capital investment in startup technology companies, but Chinese investment accounts for about 15% of the deals. In the past 8 years, there were more than 1,300 rounds of funding for U.S. startups with at least one Chinese investor, Lysenko says, totaling about $11 billion of Chinese investment. It is very common for Chinese firms to have some sort of ties to the government, Lysenko says, and those ties can be in many different forms. It might just be because they have to answer to the government and party leaders back at home, and that confers on the state some level of control, essentially, over every Chinese firm. After a record 2017, Rhodium Group predicts 2018 will be another record year for Chinese venture capital into U.S. startups. Lysenko says this has become a concern in national security circles because the nature of emerging technology is inherently dual use. Artificial intelligence algorithms that help speed up your smartphone could also be applied to weapons on the battlefield. Lysenko says he is not aware of any smoking gun cases where Chinese venture capital had plundered sensitive technology from the U.S. with malicious intent, but, he adds, that being said, I think it's become increasingly acknowledged that this risk exists, that venture capital and other minority investments provide Chinese investors to access potentially sensitive technologies, particularly ones that are in ascent, and an early stage where U.S. government, military, and other security individuals haven't had a full chance to evaluate the implications of those technologies. American venture capital still far surpasses Chinese funding, but many American tech startups depend on Chinese investment to stay afloat, says Chris Nicholson, the CEO of SkyMind, a San Francisco-based startup that makes open-source artificial intelligence tools for businesses and employs about 30 people in the U.S., Canada, and Asia. Nicholson helped create SkyMind in November of 2014. He says the company, like many startups, was fragile in the beginning until it got its first investment, $200,000 from Chinese consumer tech powerhouse Tencent. We got that $200K check and nobody else followed, but it allowed us to survive, and that's just like the whole trick of startups is just surviving, he says. Buy yourself enough time until you can realize your idea and test it on the market. Nicholson says SkyMind now has funding from some major American venture capitalists and a few smaller Chinese ones. He says no investor has ever asked SkyMind for confidential technical information. Right now, we have a board of 2 people, me and my co-founder, and we're both American, he says. For decades, funding for U.S. firms, tech firms like Nicholson's, often came through the Defense Department, whose support helped create technological breakthroughs that led to things like semiconductors and miniaturized GPS. But that Pentagon funding over the years has become slow and cumbersome, while private sector technology creation moved much faster. The Pentagon recognized the problem and in 2015 set up the Defense Innovative Unit to speed up funding to American startups, says Lieutenant Colonel David Rothzide, spokesman with the DIU. We are trying to grow the defense industry base by enticing these companies that traditionally wouldn't work with us and honestly don't need to work with us, but have a great capability that we would all benefit from, he says. Rothschild says the DIU has awarded about 80 projects to private commercial tech startups since August 2015. They were able to get those contracts finished in 2 to 3 months, remarkably faster than the traditional procurement system, which could take years, Rothschild says. Even as the Pentagon tries to reignite relations with the commercial tech world, Congress is working to curtail Chinese investment. It is broadening the authority of the Committee of Foreign Investment in the United States, an interagency committee based at the Treasury Department that examines national security risks of foreign investments in the U.S. Didn't we hear about that one with remember during the time that I guess Trump and others were charging that Hillary Clinton had, as Secretary of State, single-handedly, of course, engineered the sale of, what was it, Uranium One? Was that the name of the outfit that I guess the Russians had bought? I think that's where we last heard of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. CFIUS can make recommendations to the president on whether to block deals based on national security concerns, something President Trump has done 5 times, including blocking a Chinese state-backed company's attempt last September to buy Lattice Semiconductor for $1.3 billion. This actually reminds me of something completely different, but a totally different sector. But didn't we read longer ago and then get reminded more recently about the move of the ambassador's residence, the United States ambassador to the UN, that of course being in the news just recently since Nikki Haley resigned. But part of the deal was there's super expensive curtains, but they were going into the new residence, which had moved from the traditional location, the Waldorf Astoria, as I recall, if you can believe that. But they moved the UN ambassador's residence when a Chinese investment company bought the Waldorf Astoria. So they may be doing this across all sorts of sectors, not just tech. Just thought I'd bring that up, because otherwise I'm just reading you the story. That's the value added. In August, Trump signed into law reform of the Foreign Investment Committee, allowing it to more closely scrutinize all sorts of Chinese inroads in the U.S. tech sector, says Mario Mancuso, who leads the international trade and national security practice at Kirkland & Ellis, an international law firm, and is the author of A Dealmaker's Guide to CFIUS. I don't know whether they have any kind of pronounceable acronym for that. CFIUS, maybe. Sounds pretty tech savvy. Mancuso says, not everyone in the U.S. business community is happy with the new law. I think some deals where there are Chinese investors will be a lot harder. More deals will get a lot more scrutiny, and some deals are just not going to happen, he says. Many U.S. tech companies have pushed back against tougher laws on foreign investment, saying it could strangle innovation. It could take weeks and cost an investor thousands of dollars to do a, let's call it, CFIUS investigation, which can scare off potential investors. I think we may have even heard that that was the way they pronounced that acronym at some point. SkyMine's Nicholson believes there are legitimate national security interests around technology that deserve legislation, but technology is moving fast in a lot of countries. He warns that the U.S. could be left behind. That's the flip side of that story. In Washington, D.C., people think innovation is an American monopoly. They think that people can't go anywhere else for innovation, he says. But, he emphasizes, that's not true. So, if we shut the doors here, that capital is just going to flow through another door, and it's going to be outside of U.S. jurisdiction. That's the conundrum now for Washington. How to balance U.S. national security concerns with a drive to be the leader in advanced technology. Very interesting side-by-side to read along with that previous piece on China. It's not an easy area to deal in. Got to walk a fine line, except we have a dotard walking that line for us. Aren't we in luck? Well, we are going to have to double back and away from China off to one of our other favorite Friday targets. We have just got to catch up with this story of Jamal Khashoggi and bring you the latest. I'm sure you would have read it or seen it by now. It was too much of a blockbuster headline to miss it, but we might as well get it on the record. I have here the Washington Post with the shocking headline, Turks tell the U.S. That they have audio and video recordings that support the conclusion that Khashoggi was killed. I guess they don't have audio and video of the actual, well, they don't have the video of the killing. That would pretty much seal the case. But they have audio that basically sounds like they captured the actual killing. This is an outrageous and amazing story, not least because it means that the Turks were, in a very intrusive way, spying on the Saudi consulate. It must be that they have some extraordinary evidence in order to blow that cover. Although perhaps everyone assumes that every embassy and consulate is wired. The Turkish government has told U.S. officials that it has audio and video recordings that prove Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi was killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul this month, according to U.S. and Turkish officials. By the way, byline on this for Shane Harris, Soad Mekhenet, John Hudson, and Ann Gearin. The recordings show that a Saudi security team detained Khashoggi in the consulate after he walked in on October 2nd to obtain an official document before his upcoming wedding, then killed him and dismembered his body, the officials said. We knew that much before this latest article. Anyway, as shocking as that is, we did know it. The audio recording in particular provides some of the most persuasive and gruesome evidence that the Saudi team is responsible for Khashoggi's death, the officials said. The voice recording from inside the embassy lays out what happened to Jamal after he entered, said one person with knowledge of the recording who, like others, spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss highly sensitive intelligence. That's pretty sensitive stuff. You can pretty much say that. You can hear his voice and the voices of men speaking Arabic, this person said. You can hear how he was interrogated, tortured, and then murdered. A second person, briefed on the recording, said men could be heard beating Khashoggi. The journalist has had long-standing ties to the Saudi royal family, but has written critically of the current government and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The existence of such evidence would explain why Turkish officials were quick to accuse Saudi Arabia of killing Khashoggi. We heard you do it. But Turkish officials are wary of releasing the recordings, fearing they could divulge how the Turks spy on foreign entities in their country, the officials said. It's not clear that U.S. officials have seen the footage or listened to the audio, but Turkish officials have described their contents to their American counterparts. Saudi officials have denied any involvement in the disappearance of Khashoggi, saying he left the consulate shortly after entering. And he may have, he just did it in pieces. That's the problem. Turkey said Thursday it has agreed to a request by Saudi Arabia to form a joint committee to probe what happened to Khashoggi. Mohammed has billed himself as a reformer and moderating force in Saudi Arabia. It's interesting. I'm now beginning to hear people refer to him as Mohammed rather than Mohammed bin Salman or MBS. Mohammed has billed himself as a reformer and moderating force in Saudi Arabia. Doesn't sound like it, though. And he has become a key strategic partner, in particular to Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor. Kushner has tried to promote Mohammed to skeptical national security officials who have long viewed him as an impetuous and ruthless leader who has an overly simplistic view of the complex challenges the United States faces in the Middle East. Yeah, they may have him right there. During a bill signing Thursday in the Oval Office, President Trump called Khashoggi's suspected killing a terrible thing, but stopped short of assigning blame. And, of course, in true dotardly fashion here, we're looking at it very strongly, Trump said. We'll be having a report out soon. We're working with Turkey. We're working with Saudi Arabia. What's happened is a terrible thing, assuming it happened. I mean, maybe we'll be pleasantly surprised, but somehow I tend to doubt it. Well, that's just genius. Within the White House on Capitol Hill and among U.S. intelligence officials, there's a growing belief that Khashoggi is dead and that Saudi Arabia is to blame. Yeah, I guess so. That conclusion is driven in part by U.S. intelligence reports before Khashoggi's disappearance that show Mohammed ordered an operation to lure Khashoggi back to Saudi Arabia, where he was to be detained. U.S. officials familiar with the reports described them to the Washington Post. One U.S. official said there was no intelligence that showed the Saudis wanted to lure Khashoggi to the consulate in Istanbul. Intelligence officials and experts have speculated in recent days that the 15-man Saudi security team that Turkish officials say was sent to Istanbul may have intended to capture Khashoggi and take him back to Saudi Arabia and not to kill him. But they brought bone saws with them anyway, just in case, I guess. Sure. The person who was briefed on the audio recording said it shows that after killing Khashoggi, the security team went to the home of the Saudi consul general, where staff were told to go home early. This is evidence of at least one phone call. There is, rather, evidence of at least one phone call as well from inside the consulate, this person said. Despite a growing demand for information about Khashoggi's whereabouts, U.S. officials had few public answers Thursday, more than a week after he disappeared. The State Department said that it expects the Saudi ambassador to the United States to return from a trip home and provide information about Khashoggi's status without delay. I do not expect that, but okay. We have said to him that we expect information upon his return to the United States, State Department spokeswoman Heather Nauert said in a briefing with reporters. She added that the United States has offered to provide law enforcement resources to Turkey, but declined to say whether investigators were on the ground there. On Capitol Hill, some lawmakers were frustrated that the White House hadn't disclosed more information about Khashoggi before and after he disappeared. Some lawmakers said the administration should consider curtailing sales of weapons to the kingdom. Arms sales, I think, are certainly going to be a huge concern if there is responsibility that is irrefutable, said Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado, of any potential evidence showing a Saudi role in Khashoggi's suspected killing, like audio tapes of him being killed, for instance. Gardner said that the Trump administration had left senators in the dark about intelligence pointing to Saudi Arabia and demanded that officials give lawmakers a fuller account of what they knew of possible threats to Khashoggi's safety before he disappeared. There's a lot of information that we don't know that we need to get. There's an information gap that needs to be filled promptly by the administration and by the intelligence community, Gardner said. The immediate question has to be what exists. The answer to that needs to be acting on the information that we had. What did we do with it? I think you're going to be disappointed and then cover up. It'll be interesting to watch him contort himself later on. Senator Bob Corker, another person who occasionally flirts with being independent of Trump, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said that he had seen no definitive proof of who might have killed Khashoggi, but everything I've seen points to the Saudis. We have no evidence that points anywhere but to them. Too bad there's no corroborating evidence, eh? On Wednesday, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle wrote to Trump and asked him to impose sanctions against anyone found responsible for Khashoggi's disappearance, including Saudi leaders. The lawmakers invoked the Global Magnitsky Act. That's what this is for, but you know how much he loves the Magnitsky Act, right? Giving the president 120 days to make a decision. Soon, very soon. On Tuesday, Kushner and National Security Advisor John Bolton called Mohammed. Hello, Mohammed. Did you saw him into pieces or anything? And encouraged him to be transparent about what Riyadh knows about Khashoggi, said officials familiar with the call. U.S. officials, however, pushed back on calls to halt arms sales to Riyadh, calling such demands premature. I wonder if anybody could propose halting bone saw sales there. I think they're jumping to conclusions, said Nauert, the State Department spokeswoman. This is entirely a hypothetical situation at this point. We don't know what happened. We don't have the facts of the case. Trump also dismissed the possibility, and here's how he did it. No, we know them very well. They're nice people. No, they're spending $110 billion purchasing military equipment and other things, thank you. He said of the Saudis, if we don't sell it to them, they'll say, well, thank you very much. We'll buy it from Russia. Or, thank you very much, we'll buy it from China. That doesn't help us. Not when it comes to jobs, and not when it comes to our companies losing out on that work. That is a hell of a view of these things. And, of course, you should keep in mind that his consistent and ongoing violation of the emoluments clause, particularly with respect to the Saud family, is particularly troublesome here. President's on the take from murderers and doesn't really know whether or not we should do anything about it when we catch them murdering people who are living and working in the United States. I understand that the president also made a point to say, well, he's not an American citizen, right? This happened, look, it's happened in Turkey, okay? It's Turkey. I mean, who even knows what happens there? He's not even an American citizen. So, huge international outrage, huge violation of human rights. It's a friggin' murder by the diplomatic corps of the Saudish state in Turkey, another allied nation. This guy, another one of these situations, just a huge power vacuum in United States leadership that autocrats around the world are taking advantage of and pushing the limits of every day, every minute, every hour. It's unbelievable. And this idiot president of ours has nothing to say about it. I don't know what happened. It's a terrible thing what happened. If it happened, maybe it didn't happen. I don't know. Maybe he's stuck under a 400-pound guy on the bed somewhere. We don't know. Maybe he's stuck under Bart O'Kavanaugh on a bed somewhere. This guy, there's no limits. There's no bottom, I guess. Just another example of things swirling the bowl once again. All right, let's see if I can fit one last story in here, and it might be a good way to kill two birds with one stone. Something I put aside, a story actually a few weeks ago, I think maybe a little less than a few weeks, from Jane Meyer at the New Yorker, but I never did get to read that piece. I had, let me see, somewhere here in Pocket, had a rather distinctive graphic that went with it. Ah, yes, how Russia helped swing the election for Trump. Always an interesting topic, of course, to look into. This was a Jane Meyer article that made it even more interesting. This was September 24th. I did not get to read that. However, I stumbled across a different take on the same subject very recently. And it also makes mention of one of the other stories that we have not yet mentioned, but really needs to get on the record. So let's see if we can quickly get through this version. This from Will Bunch, who a lot of you also follow on Twitter and in the Philly Inquirer. This prominent Penn prof, that is University of Pennsylvania professor, didn't believe Russia got Trump elected. Here's what changed her mind. That's an interesting take on it and a more intriguing title, even though it's always intriguing to read a Jane Meyer piece. In the excruciatingly loud and far too often flippant world of what passes for political analysis in the 21st century, thanks, Will, the University of Pennsylvania's Kathleen Hall Jamieson, that is a prominent Penn prof, isn't it, has always been, and here in caps, the serious one. Not all caps, just capitalized. I don't mean that in a bad sense. The 71-year-old longtime director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center on the Ivy League campus has a cheerful good humor, more amused than I when my yapping 6-pound toy dog kept interrupting our phone interview, like Abby. I mean that her careful research-based expertise into the way that Americans communicate, or more frequently don't communicate, about politics means that you're more likely to see her quoted on the gray pages of the New York Times than caught up in the nightly crossfire of CNN or MSNBC. Jameson is, simply put, the last person you'd ever label a conspiracy theorist, which is exactly why her brand new book, Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President, dropped like a neutron bomb right into the middle of 2018's fraught midterm elections. Jameson's data-driven tome raises the notion that Russia's 2016 election interference campaign of hacked emails and Facebook trolls tipped the election to President Trump from the stuff of Twitter memes to the realm of academic proof. The Penn professor's argument is bolstered not just by her decades-long reputation as a thought leader in the intersection of politics and communication, but by the fact that, like most of her ilk, she tended at first to dismiss the notion that Russian meddling had reached the level that it had caused Trump to win and Hillary Clinton to lose. I went into it more than an agnostic. I went into it actively skeptical, she said, but she said she started to dig deeper and to change her mind in the process when she tried to make sense of her data, showing an unexpected drop in support for Clinton after the televised debates. That decline was driven by voters who believed Clinton says one thing and believes something different. The drop-off happened even as broader polls suggested Clinton had won the debates. And while the number of voters who expressed greater distrust of the Democratic nominee was not huge, they were the ones who said they were now less likely to vote for her. Jameson said, "She came to think my debate finding was actually a hack finding." She explained her research suggested that questions asked by debate moderators and based on the Democratic emails and papers we now know were hacked by Russian spies, for example, a hacked 2013 speech in which Clinton told the much maligned Wall Street firm Goldman Sachs that, quote, "what you do is really important," unquote, were the things convincing voters that the Democratic nominee was two-faced. That message, we now know, was amplified by an army of Russian trolls on Facebook and Twitter. It almost had to hit me over the head to realize that I had data to help address it, she said of her research into the 3 fall 2016 debates showing Clinton's late decline in support. In the end, it was fewer than 100,000 votes in 3 key states that normally vote Democratic in presidential elections, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, that swung the Electoral College to Trump. Jameson said her research suggested that illegal activity by Russia was more than enough to account for that small margin of difference, but the complex evidence doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. Rather, it takes a book, the one she wrote, to make her case. In Cyber War, she traces how media discussion of the hacked Democratic emails and other documents gave the Trump campaign and the online troll army that constantly reinforced the GOP candidate's message became a talking point in early October 2016 that muted bad news for Trump, such as the Access Hollywood tape in which he bragged of sexual assault. Jameson also traces in Cyber War an almost uncanny ability by the Russians, led by 13 alleged spies indicted by Special Counsel Robert Mueller earlier this year, to send Facebook messages and ads to reach the most critical voters, including Christian evangelicals persuaded to stay with Trump despite the sleaze of the Access Hollywood tape, or raising doubts about Clinton with black voters that the Russian meddlers wanted to stay home on Election Day. Since writing the book, Jameson, along with the others most carefully following the Trump-Russia probe, has been intrigued by a finding in one of Mueller's newer indictments that Russians successfully hacked the Clinton campaign's internal modeling of voter turnout. That would have made it easier for the trolls to find the Americans most likely to stay home or vote for a third-party candidate like Jill Stein instead of Clinton. But she also noted that the Russians could have figured out which voters to target by tracking the movements of Trump, especially when he campaigned more frequently in the Rust Belt. There could have been coordination, but there didn't have to be, she said. Jameson also noted that Russian hacking essentially spooked some of the key players in 2016. For example, she noted Russian activities influenced the then FBI director James Comey's decisions to defy tradition and talk publicly about the probe into Clinton's emails after the FBI received word that Vladimir Putin's agents might release documents, fabricated, it eventually turned out, that Attorney General Loretta Lynch was compromised in that investigation. Some may ask, so what? We're well past November 2016, and Trump, whether or not his election was legitimate, is putting an indelible stamp on the Supreme Court and issues like climate change for the next generation. But the vulnerabilities exposed in Jameson's book, the ability of a powerful, deep-pocketed, hostile actor to wage a cyber war against democracy by using military-tested psychological warfare, or PSYOPs, on voters, loom larger than ever in the new election cycle. This week, the New York Times reported that the Trump campaign also weighed a plan from an Israeli contractor, that's the other thing I wanted to get on the record here, called the Psy Group, to wage a form of political psyops to thwart his final challenger for the GOP nomination, Senator Ted Cruz, that would have created bogus personas to influence delegates to the Cleveland convention. Team Trump insists the Psy Group was never hired even though a Trump-connected Middle East lobbyist paid it $2 million late in 2016, but maybe that's because it had stumbled onto a better deal with the Russians, who would do this for free, of course. Already in the 2018 midterms, with nearly a month left in the campaign, several candidates, at least 3, according to Microsoft, which blamed the same Russian crowd that was active in 2016, have been hacked, including the office of Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill, locked in a tight race in Missouri. Once again, the body politic is braced for an onslaught of trolls, dubious Facebook posts, and actual fake news in the election's closing days. Jameson said a lot of responsibility falls on the media, which uncritically reported the contents of Russian hacking in 2016, with next to no internal debate about the propriety of printing stolen information. She also said journalists should do a better job of understanding how just a handful of misleading Facebook posts can be shared across millions of platforms with disastrous consequences for democracy. 2 years later, the extent of Russian interference in American politics is still a subject of debate, but the more important questions have already been answered. Powerful players have both the tools and the knowledge to wage psychological warfare on everyday voters, and they are already deploying them. The man in the best position to crack down on these abuses, the President of the United States, seems to have benefited from them. So what can the rest of us do? Good question. We're stuck with the dotard for the time being, I guess. We're going to have to come out in overwhelming numbers. That's our only hope. All right, well, that about wraps it up for what we'll be able to bring you for today's episode of the show on this Friday afternoon. You'll have to depend on Justice Putnam to bring you the rest on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. And, of course, because we're pre-recording, I don't have the lineup of fantastic stories that he has set to bring you right here on Netroots Radio following the close of this show. We will see you next week when we return on Monday with Greg Dworkin in tow to help us round up the stories of the weekend and try and make sense of all the craziness that happened in the interim. And, well, let's see. I don't think there's that much more that we could have possibly have fit in, although there's still much more, and I can only take a wild guess at this point at what we may have learned while our pre-recorded show was rolling, possibly about what happened in Turkey and the consulate in Istanbul. I don't know how much darker that timeline can get, but I suppose there's always room for them to surprise us with something. Let's see, anything else that we want to shoehorn in here? I don't think there's anything else we can drop before we get out. But perhaps we can pick up on Monday. I'll promise you this, and then they'll probably fail to deliver by the time Monday rolls around. Some other craziness will come. The one thing I wanted to get to that we won't be able to fit into today, there's further reporting, and you did hear some of it on Justice's show earlier in the week. Is there a new connection emerging between that Russian Alpha Bank and the Trump campaign? That weird server story that seemed like such a strange conspiracy theory that no one could quite make sense of way back when appears to be in the news again. I'd love to find out what the new twist is on that one. We'll save that one for next week, or at least the thread of it for next week. We'll see you on Monday. Have a great weekend. Hope things don't go too
From
too
Daily
crazy.
Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.